I still remember the day it happened like it was yesterday. The sky was calm, the driveway was clear, and there was this light breeze carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass from somewhere down the street. I had just parked the truck in front of the house, the one we had been working so hard to make ours. My wife, Elena, stepped out, smiling, holding that little cardboard box full of photo frames she didn't want anyone else to pack. She said she wanted to be the one to place them in the new living room herself. It was a quiet moment. A good one. But in this neighborhood, even the quiet moments never seemed to last. We'd only been here a short while. Most of the neighbors still didn't know us by name, but I could already tell which ones were going to be trouble. You can spot them a mile away, the kind of people who stare a little too long, who pretend to be trimming a hedge but are really listening to every word you say. The ones who think the HOA badge on their chest is the same thing as a police badge. And in the middle of them all was Karen. The kind of person who didn't just live in the neighborhood, she patrolled it, breathed it, and seemed to think she owned it. Elena carried her box up the walkway while I followed behind with a bigger load. We were in no rush. It was just another step toward building the life we wanted together. And that's when I saw the blinds in the house across the street snap open. Just a flash of movement, but I knew exactly who it was. Karen. Watching. Always watching. A second later, her front door swung open and out she came, arms crossed, eyes locked on us like we had just dumped a pile of garbage on her lawn. I tried to keep my eyes on my own driveway. I wasn't looking for a fight. But Karen didn't need an invitation. She marched right over, her sneakers tapping against the pavement like they had a purpose of their own. She didn't even say hello. She went straight into questions, fast, sharp, and way too personal. Who's moving in? Do you have permission for this? Did you file with the HOA? It was less like a neighborly chat and more like an interrogation. Elena froze halfway up the steps, that box of photo frames still in her hands. I could see the way her smile faded, replaced with confusion. She glanced at me like she was asking if this was a joke. Karen didn't wait for an answer. She stepped closer, lowering her voice but making sure her tone stayed razor-sharp. You can't just bring people in without going through the proper channels. That's how problems start. She said it like Elena was some stranger I'd picked up off the street, like she wasn't my wife, like she didn't belong here. I could feel the heat building in my chest, but I knew better than to blow up. That's what people like her feed on. I told her, calmly but firmly, that this was my wife and she had every right to be here. I thought that would be enough to shut it down. It wasn't. Karen's eyes narrowed. Her phone was in her hand before I even realized she had taken it out. She stepped back, dialed, and without a second thought she started talking into it. I caught bits of it, words like trespassing, unauthorized, possible safety concern. She wasn't just calling someone to complain. She was calling the police. Elena's face went pale. This was supposed to be a happy day, the day we brought her things into our home. Now she was standing there wondering if she was about to be questioned by officers for the crime of moving in with her husband. I set my boxes down slowly, not because they were heavy but because I needed to keep my hands steady. You don't want to give people like Karen anything they can twist into a story. Karen paced a few steps away, still talking into her phone. Every so often she glanced back at us with that smug look people get when they think they're winning. I wanted to tell her she was out of line, that she was making a fool of herself, but instead I just stood there, silent, letting her dig her own hole. Elena stepped down from the porch, standing beside me now, her fingers gripping my arm just tight enough for me to feel her pulse racing. She didn't have to say anything. I could tell she was scared, confused, and angry all at once. Minutes passed, though it felt longer. And then, in the distance, I saw them, the flashing red and blue lights weaving through the neighborhood streets. My stomach sank. Karen noticed them too. She stopped pacing and straightened up like a soldier waiting for backup. I don't think she realized what she had really set in motion. And standing there in my own driveway, I knew this day wasn't going to end the way she thought it would. The sound of those sirens grew louder, bouncing off the quiet houses, cutting through the stillness like a warning. Neighbors started appearing at windows, peeking from behind curtains, some even stepping out onto their porches just to see what was going on. It was like the whole street had been waiting for this kind of drama, and Karen had just delivered the show they didn't know they wanted. Elena shifted closer to me. I could feel the tension in her grip. This wasn't her world. She wasn't used to dealing with people who weaponized rules and pretended to be the law. She had been ready to spend the afternoon unpacking dishes and hanging curtains, not standing in our driveway like some criminal suspect. The police car slowed, then rolled to a stop right in front of our house. The engine stayed running, lights still flashing. 2 officers stepped out, one tall with a shaved head, the other shorter with sunglasses that hid his eyes. They didn't come rushing over like there was an emergency. Instead, they walked at that deliberate pace officers use when they know they're in control of the situation. Karen wasted no time. She practically jogged to meet them, her voice already raised, spilling her version of events before they'd even asked a single question. She just showed up out of nowhere. Karen's voice carried. I don't know who she is, she's moving boxes in, no notice to the HOA, no paperwork, nothing. I told them this isn't allowed, nobody listens. She jabbed her finger in our direction like she was pointing out an escaped convict. The taller officer glanced at us, then back at her. He didn't seem particularly alarmed. He let her keep talking until she started repeating herself, then he cut her off politely. Ma'am, will speak to them directly. Karen folded her arms and stepped back, but she stayed close enough to hear every word. The shorter officer approached first, nodding at me. Afternoon. Can we ask what's going on here? His tone was calm, almost casual, but I could feel the weight of his attention. I told him exactly what was happening, that this was my wife, she was moving in, and we owned this home. I kept it simple, no extra details for anyone to twist. Elena spoke up too, her voice steady but soft. I just got here with some of my things. We were moving them inside when she came over and started yelling. She didn't look at Karen when she said it. She kept her eyes on the officer, like she was making sure her words landed exactly where they needed to. The taller officer joined us now, hands resting lightly on his duty belt. Do you have any ID, ma'am? He asked Elena. She nodded and handed it over without hesitation. He studied it for a moment, then glanced at the address on our mailbox. This your current address? She nodded again. Okay, he said, handing it back. Behind them, Karen shifted her weight impatiently. She clearly didn't like how calm this was going. She jumped in again from a few steps away. Ask her if she filed her residency change with the HOA. That's required. They can't just bypass procedure. The taller officer turned toward her, his voice still calm. Ma'am, this is a civil matter, not a criminal one. They're not breaking any laws. That should have been the end of it, but Karen wasn't ready to let go. She started talking about community safety, about needing to know who was in the neighborhood, about protocols and standards. She threw every HOA buzzword she could think of into the air, hoping one would stick. The shorter officer finally cut her off. We're not here to enforce HOA rules. That's between you and your board. He looked back at me. You're good to continue moving in. Simple. Direct. And exactly what I already knew. But Karen didn't take the hint. Her voice rose, her face turning a shade redder with each word. This is why we have problems in this neighborhood. No one respects the rules. No one cares about the people who actually live here. She was unraveling right in front of everyone, her frustration turning into a public spectacle. One of the neighbors across the street pulled out their phone, clearly recording. Karen noticed and her tone shifted, trying to sound more composed, but the damage was done. She looked less like a responsible neighbor and more like someone who'd just lost control over a situation she thought she could dominate. The officers exchanged a quick glance, then started back toward their car. They weren't going to waste more time on this. The taller one gave me a small nod. Have a good day, sir. Elena exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for the last 15 minutes. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her jaw tight, watching the officers get back into their cruiser. She didn't look at us, not directly. She just turned and walked quickly toward her house, muttering under her breath. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She might have lost this round, but she wasn't done. Not yet. The police cruiser rolled away, its flashing lights fading into the distance, leaving behind an awkward stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Elena and I stood there for a moment, still holding the same boxes we had when all this started. It should have been over. The cops had told us we were fine. We should have been able to walk back into the house, unpack and get on with our lives. But I could feel it, this wasn't done. Not with Karen. She didn't look back at us as she marched up her driveway. Her steps were sharp, deliberate, like she was walking away just to keep from saying something worse. But even from across the street, I could see her lips moving, fast and low, like she was already rehearsing whatever story she was about to tell next. Elena nudged me lightly, her voice barely above a whisper. She's not going to let this go, is she? I didn't answer right away. My eyes stayed on Karen as she disappeared into her house. The blinds snapped shut behind her like she was sealing off her little fortress. I knew exactly what she was doing in there. She was calling someone. And not just anyone. People like Karen always have someone on speed dial in the HOA chain of command. We went back to unloading the truck, trying to ignore the tension that still clung to the street. But it wasn't long before I spotted movement again, this time not from Karen's house. A man in a pressed polo shirt and khaki pants was striding down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched neatly on his nose. He wasn't from around here. No one dressed like that in this neighborhood unless they were coming straight from a board meeting or trying way too hard to look official. Elena caught sight of him too. "Who's that?" she asked. I didn't have to guess. "HOA, I muttered under my breath. Sure enough, he slowed as he reached our driveway, offering a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Afternoon," he said, his voice smooth but clipped. "I'm Daniel, Vice President of the Homeowners Association. I understand there's been a situation." His gaze drifted toward the boxes stacked near the door, then to Elena, as if he were mentally taking notes on her existence. I told him the police had already come and gone, and that they'd confirmed we weren't doing anything illegal. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected me to say that but didn't plan on letting it stop him. "Be that as it may," he said, flipping a page on his clipboard, "our association has certain procedures that need to be followed when a new resident moves in. We require notice, background checks, verification of residency." "Background checks," Elena repeated, her eyebrows pulling together. "This is my husband's home. I'm not renting a room here. I live here now." Daniel didn't flinch. "That may be true, but in this community all residents, owners or otherwise, must be registered with the HOA. Failure to do so can result in fines or further action." I could feel my jaw tightening. Further action was HOA code for whatever scare tactic they felt like using that week. Karen hadn't been able to get rid of us with the police, so now she'd sent in her backup with a rulebook. Daniel asked for our paperwork, something I knew didn't even exist for what they were asking. Elena tried to explain again that she had just moved in, that we were married, that this was our home. But I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't there to understand. He was there to build a case. After a few minutes of back and forth that went nowhere, Daniel closed his clipboard with a snap. "All right. You'll be hearing from us shortly," he said, like it was a promise rather than a warning. He gave us that tight smile again before walking back the way he came, already tapping something into his phone. Elena stood frozen for a moment, her box still in her arms. "What does that even mean?" she asked, her voice carrying both frustration and disbelief. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because I knew all too well. It meant that somewhere, probably within the hour, we'd be getting an official notice. And I was right. It couldn't have been more than 20 minutes later when I heard footsteps approaching. Not Karen this time, someone else. A woman in a tailored navy suit, carrying a thick envelope, stopped at the bottom of our steps. Her heels clicked sharply against the concrete. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't smile. She simply asked for my wife by name. Elena stepped forward, still confused, and the woman handed her the envelope. "You've been served," she said, her tone cold and efficient. And just like that, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving us standing in the doorway, staring at the heavy paper in my wife's hands. Elena's eyes searched mine, looking for answers. I didn't have any to give, not yet. But I could see the words printed on the outside of the envelope. Large, bold, and impossible to miss. Notice of eviction. Elena held the envelope like it might burn her fingers if she gripped it too tightly. The weight of it wasn't in the paper, it was in what it meant. She turned it over once, twice, as if doing that would make the words change. But they didn't. They stayed there in that bold, black font that felt like it was shouting at us. I could see the confusion in her eyes turning into something else, something sharper. She didn't rip the envelope open right away. She slid her thumb carefully under the seal, as if she already knew whatever was inside was meant to be handled with care. The paper inside was thick, the kind of stock lawyers use when they want their documents to feel heavier than they really are. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes scanning the first lines. Then she stopped reading. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers curled just slightly around the edges. "They're saying, I have to leave this property immediately," she said, her voice low but steady. "They're calling me an unauthorized occupant." She read a little more, her eyebrows lifting in disbelief. "They're giving me 72 hours to vacate." 72 hours. I stepped closer, glancing over her shoulder. The language was as cold and mechanical as I'd expected. It didn't matter that we were married. It didn't matter that this was our home. The document was written to make her sound like a trespasser, someone who'd wandered in without permission and set up camp. And somewhere, sitting comfortably in her house across the street, Karen was probably watching from behind those blinds, smiling. Elena folded the paper back into the envelope with the same deliberate care she'd used to open it. But when she looked up at me again, I saw it, the shift. The confusion was gone. The fear was gone. What replaced them was resolve. They picked the wrong person, she said quietly, almost to herself. She disappeared into the house for a few minutes. I followed her in, still carrying a half-empty moving box I'd forgotten I was holding. When I found her in the kitchen, she was sitting at the table, her laptop open, her phone beside it. Her posture had changed completely, straight-backed, focused, already working. "Elena?" I asked carefully. She didn't look up from the screen. "I'm reading our HOA bylaws," she said. "I'm also looking up state property laws. And I'm checking something else, because if they think they can threaten me with this, they're in for a surprise." That's when it hit me. Elena wasn't just a pediatric ICU nurse. Before she went into nursing full-time, she had worked for a law firm, specifically in tenant landlord and property law. She wasn't a lawyer, but she knew the rules. She knew the loopholes. And she knew exactly how to read between the lines. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. She wasn't just reacting, she was preparing. Every now and then she'd stop typing, scroll, and let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "They really think this is enforceable? This isn't even written correctly," she muttered. She clicked something, copied a paragraph, and began drafting a response. I stood there, still half in awe, half in disbelief. "You're going to fight this?" I asked. She finally looked up, her eyes locking on mine with absolute certainty. "I'm not just going to fight it," she said. "I'm going to end it." It was in that moment I realized Karen had made a fatal mistake. She had underestimated my wife. To Karen, this was just another petty neighborhood battle. A new resident she could push around until they left or fell in line. What she didn't know was that she had handed eviction papers to someone who had spent years reading, dissecting, and dismantling documents exactly like the one she'd just been served. Elena started making calls. Not emotional, rambling calls, but calm, precise ones. She called a former colleague from the law firm. She called a friend who worked at the county clerk's office. She called a notary public. And with each call, the puzzle in front of her seemed to come together faster. Her voice stayed level the entire time, but I could hear that quiet fire underneath it. She wasn't raising her voice, but she was sharpening her words like tools. I watched her type up a formal notice, her fingers hitting each key like she was nailing boards into place. Every sentence was backed up with citations, HOA bylaws, state statutes, homeowner protections. She wasn't just defending herself, she was building an offense. By the time the sun started to dip low over the rooftops, she had a neatly printed packet sitting on the table beside her. It wasn't thick, but it didn't need to be. It was precise. It was devastating. She slipped it into a clean manila envelope and sealed it with a single confident press of her palm. She looked up at me then, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Tomorrow," she said simply. "Tomorrow we pay Karen a visit." The next morning came with that heavy kind of silence a neighborhood gets before something big happens. The air was still, almost too still, and the sunlight had that sharp early day edge to it. Elena was already up, dressed in a fitted blazer and dark jeans, her hair pulled back in a way that said she meant business. The manila envelope sat on the kitchen counter like it was waiting to be unleashed. She picked it up, checked the seal one last time, and slid it under her arm as if it were an extension of herself. I grabbed my coffee and followed her out the door. We didn't say much as we walked down the driveway. Across the street, Karen's blinds were tilted open just enough to catch a flash of movement. Hers peeking out, trying to figure out what we were up to. I saw the blinds twitch shut again the moment our eyes met. Elena didn't knock when we reached Karen's front steps. She didn't hesitate. She pressed the doorbell once and then stepped back just enough to give space, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. A moment later, the door creaked open. Karen stood there in a robe, her hair a little wild from sleep, but her expression was the same mixture of suspicion and self-importance it always was. Before Karen could get a word out, Elena spoke, her tone crisp and even. "Good morning. I believe you've been expecting me." The way she said it made Karen's lips press into a thin line. She tried to recover her composure, folding her arms across her chest like a shield. "If this is about your situation," she said, letting the word drip with condescension, "you'll need to go through the HOA. I don't make the rules." Elena reached into the envelope, pulled out a neatly stapled packet and held it out. "Actually, you do. And you've broken them." The way Karen's eyes flicked down to the papers told me she wasn't expecting that. She didn't take them at first, just kept her arms crossed as if refusing would make them disappear. But Elena didn't move her hand away. She just waited, silent, until Karen finally reached out, snatching the packet like it might bite her. "I suggest you read those carefully," Elena continued. "They're a formal notice of violation. Several, actually. including harassment, abuse of process, and misrepresentation of HOA authority. Karen's eyes darted over the first page, and I could see the color drain from her face. She tried to laugh it off, too loudly, too forced. This is ridiculous. You think you can just make accusations like this? Elena didn't flinch. They're not accusations. They're documented incidents, complete with dates, witnesses, and citations from your own bylaws. And copies have already been filed with the HOA board and the county clerk's office. Karen's voice faltered for a second. You went to the county? She asked, her tone tightening. Yes, Elena said simply. And I'll be attending the next HOA board meeting to make sure these are addressed on record. I also have a meeting scheduled with the association's attorney. If the board fails to act, I'll take this to small claims court and beyond. And Karen? She paused just long enough for the tension to thicken. I have every intention of winning. I could see Karen's grip tighten on the packet, the edges bending slightly under her fingers. Her eyes flicked toward the street, where a couple of neighbors had conveniently stepped outside to check the mail. They weren't fooling anyone, they were watching. And Karen knew it. The longer she stood there, the more it seemed like she was shrinking. Her voice had lost its edge now. This is highly irregular, she muttered, trying to cling to any semblance of authority. What's irregular, Elena replied, is calling the police on a lawful resident. What's irregular is fabricating an emergency to intimidate someone. What's irregular is weaponizing HOA policy against a homeowner's family. And that ends today. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper as she shifted the packet in her hands. Her eyes flicked back down to the documents again, scanning as if searching for a loophole. But Elena had written them with surgical precision. There were no loopholes. After a long beat, Elena took a small step forward, not aggressive, just enough to close the space between them. You wanted to involve the HOA? She said quietly. Consider them involved. But next time, understand something very clearly, you don't intimidate me. And with that, she turned, walking down the steps with a calmness that was almost chilling. She didn't rush, didn't look back, didn't give Karen the satisfaction of seeing any hint of nerves. The manila envelope under her arm was empty now, but it might as well have been a loaded weapon with the way it had landed. Behind us, I could hear the faint creak of Karen's door closing. Not a slam, just a slow, measured shut, like she didn't want to draw more attention. But it was too late. The neighbors had seen. And in a community like this, word would spread faster than wildfire. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening, and by the time we arrived, the parking lot was already more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Cars lined the curb, neighbors milled around in small groups, murmuring in low voices. You could feel it. Everyone knew something was about to happen, even if they didn't know exactly what. Inside the community hall, the air was thick with that mix of perfume, coffee, and faint anxiety that always seems to cling to these meetings. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows, but people were already standing along the walls. At the front of the room sat a long table where the HOA board members were arranged like a jury, papers stacked in front of them, microphones angled toward their seats. Karen was there too, sitting near the front, her hair styled immaculately, her expression carefully arranged into something between confidence and indifference. But every so often, she'd glance at the door like she was keeping track of who was walking in. When her eyes landed on us, her smile twitched, not quite breaking but not holding steady either. Elena didn't hesitate. She walked right past Karen without even acknowledging her, heading straight for the sign-in sheet at the board's table. Her heels clicked softly against the tile, each step deliberate. She signed her name in bold, unshaken strokes, then returned to the seating area with me following close behind. The meeting began with the usual dry agenda items. Budget approvals, landscaping updates, reminders about trash day. You could almost feel the room leaning forward, waiting for the real reason everyone was here. And then, finally, it came. Next, the HOA president said, adjusting his glasses, we have a formal grievance filed by a homeowner regarding harassment and misuse of HOA authority. He glanced at a sheet in front of him. Filed by Mrs. Elena Carter. All heads turned toward us. Karen shifted in her seat. Elena stood smoothly, the manila folder in her hands now thick with neatly organized pages. She walked to the front of the room, her posture straight, her voice calm but strong. Good evening, she began. I'm here to address a serious abuse of power that took place last week, involving myself, my husband, and a certain member of this association. She didn't look at Karen when she said it, but the implication hung heavy in the air. She laid the folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal the first set of documents. On this date, my wife and I were moving into our home when this member called 911, reporting me as a trespasser. The police arrived, confirmed I was a lawful resident, and left. Less than an hour later, I was served with eviction papers. Papers that were not only baseless but also in violation of multiple HOA bylaws and state property laws. The room shifted. You could hear murmurs ripple through the crowd. Karen's back stiffened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Elena continued, passing copies of her evidence down the table to the board members. Here you'll find police reports, witness statements, and recordings of interactions that show repeated harassment and misrepresentation of HOA authority. You'll also find a written statement from the county clerk's office confirming that the eviction notice I received was invalid from the start. One board member leaned closer to his mic. Mrs. Carter, to clarify, you're saying a member of this HOA fabricated an emergency call to law enforcement and issued an unauthorized eviction notice? Yes, Elena said simply. And here's the proof. The board members started flipping through the pages, their brows furrowing. A few exchanged looks. The president cleared his throat, glancing toward Karen. The member in question, do you wish to respond? Karen stood slowly, forcing a smile that looked brittle under the fluorescent lights. I was only acting in the best interest of the community, she began, her voice higher than usual. We have procedures for new residents and Elena's voice cut in, calm but firm. Those procedures don't override state law. They don't allow you to impersonate legal authority. And they certainly don't give you the right to target a homeowner's spouse as if they're a criminal. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder now, tinged with disbelief and something else, judgment. People were looking at Karen differently, whispering to one another in tones they didn't bother to keep discreet. Karen tried to salvage it, flipping through her own stack of papers like she might find a lifeline buried there. But the more she spoke, the less solid she sounded. I had concerns, it was a misunderstanding. Her words trailed off under the weight of the stares fixed on her. Elena didn't press harder, she didn't need to. The contrast between her precise, well-documented case and Karen's unraveling defense spoke for itself. One by one, the board members turned their attention away from Karen and back to Elena, asking quiet, respectful questions. By the time she finished presenting, the room felt different. The energy had shifted. Karen wasn't the watchful enforcer anymore. She was just another neighbor who had pushed too far, and everyone knew it. Elena thanked the board, gathered her folder, and walked back to her seat without a glance at Karen. The sound of her heels on the tile was louder in the silence than any gavel could have been. The board called a short recess after Elena sat down, but it wasn't the kind of break where people quietly sipped water and stretched their legs. This was the kind where small clusters of neighbors leaned in close, whispering like they were sharing the juiciest gossip they'd heard in months. Some glanced our way and nodded. Others didn't bother hiding their looks toward Karen. Whatever her reputation had been before tonight, it was shifting right here in real time. Karen stayed in her seat, staring down at her papers as if the ink might rearrange itself into something that could save her. Every now and then she glanced toward the board table, but their conversations were hushed, serious. No friendly smiles. No reassuring nods. Just that tight, clipped tone people use when they're trying to sort out a mess. When the board finally reconvened, the president adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. We've reviewed the materials presented by Mrs. Carter, he began, as well as the documentation provided by Ms. Lewis. He didn't look at Karen when he said her name, but the lack of eye contact was loud enough. Based on what we've seen, there is sufficient evidence to determine that HOA policies were misrepresented and that harassment occurred toward a lawful resident. The words landed like a stone dropped into a still pond. Murmurs rippled through the crowd and Karen's shoulders visibly tensed. She opened her mouth as if to object, but the president raised a hand. We are not opening the floor for further debate at this moment. Elena sat calmly beside me, hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. But I could feel the quiet strength radiating from her. She wasn't gloating. She didn't need to. The truth was doing that for her. The president continued. As a result, the eviction notice served to Mrs. Carter is deemed null and void. It had no legal standing from the outset. Furthermore, disciplinary action will be taken regarding the misuse of authority in this matter. He turned slightly toward the rest of the board. The recommended action is a formal written reprimand placed in the member's HOA file, loss of any committee or enforcement privileges for a period of 12 months, and mandatory attendance at a conflict resolution workshop. A couple of board members nodded. One leaned into their mic, And let's add that any future harassment toward the Carters will be grounds for immediate fines and possible legal referral. Karen's jaw tightened. Her knuckles whitened where she gripped her stack of papers. You could see it, she wanted to fight. But she didn't have anywhere to go. Not here. Not now. She was boxed in by her own actions. The president gave the gavel a sharp tap. That will be the official decision of the board. He glanced toward us. Mrs. Carter, thank you for bringing this matter to our attention in such a thorough and professional manner. We apologize for the distress this has caused you and your family. Elena inclined her head slightly. Thank you, she said simply. No grand speech. No victory lap. Just the kind of calm acknowledgement that comes from knowing you've already won. The meeting moved on to the next agenda item, but no one in the room was really listening. The air still hummed with the aftershock of what had just happened. Karen sat rigid in her seat, staring straight ahead, pretending she was still invested in a discussion about community landscaping budgets. When the meeting finally adjourned, chairs scraped against the floor, and people began drifting toward the exit in slow waves. But they weren't leaving without saying something to us first. A middle-aged man in a baseball cap stopped to shake Elena's hand. About time someone stood up to her, he said under his breath. A woman in a floral blouse leaned in close. You did the right thing. She's been like this for years. Not everyone spoke, but the nods and small smiles spoke volumes. In a community where people usually kept their heads down, this was as close to applause as you could get. Karen left without making eye contact. She kept her papers clutched to her chest and her pace brisk, like she was trying to outrun the whispers that followed her out into the parking lot. But you could see in the way heads turned as she passed, she wasn't outrunning anything. Outside, the air felt lighter, cooler, as if the whole neighborhood had exhaled at once. Elena walked beside me, her steps measured, her gaze ahead. She didn't have to say a word. I could tell she already knew what I was thinking. This wasn't just a win for us, it was a shift in the balance here. As we reached our car, she glanced back once, just briefly, at the community hall. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a glint in her eyes. Not triumph. Not spite. Just quiet certainty. She had walked into a room where the deck was stacked against her, and she had left with the cards in her hand. And from the look on Karen's face when she saw the room turn, I knew she understood that too. The neighborhood had gone strangely quiet after the board meeting, like the street itself was holding its breath. People were still friendly, maybe even friendlier, but it was a different kind of friendly now. Neighbors waved with a knowing look in their eyes, the kind that said we heard what happened, and we're glad you didn't back down. Karen, though, was a shadow of her usual self. No early morning patrols. No sudden appearances when a delivery truck slowed down. Her blinds stayed angled shut most of the day, and if she came outside at all, it was quick. Mail in, trash out, and back inside before anyone could engage her. It was like she was trying to make herself invisible. But invisibility doesn't last long here. Not when official envelopes start showing up. It was late morning when the mail truck rolled by, stopping at each house in its slow, deliberate rhythm. I was on the porch with a coffee, not expecting anything more than junk mail and maybe a flyer for a lawn service. But when the carrier stopped at Karen's box, I noticed something different. He slipped a thick, stiff envelope into the slot. Larger than standard mail, the kind that always means paperwork someone doesn't want to see. Karen must have been watching because less than a minute later, her front door creaked open. She stepped out in a robe, head down, and moved quickly to the box. She pulled out the mail, fanned through it, and then froze mid-motion. Even from my porch I could tell she knew exactly what that envelope was. She turned it over, her eyes scanning the return address, and I could see her jaw clench. She didn't look around, didn't want to meet anyone's eyes, just spun back toward her door and disappeared inside. It might have ended there if Elena hadn't come home that afternoon. She walked in carrying groceries and a faint smirk. "What?" I asked. I knew that look. She set the bags down on the counter and leaned on them casually. "Got a call from a friend of mine at the county clerk's office. Guess who just got an official violation notice from the HOA board?" I didn't even have to guess. "Karen." "Karen," Elena confirmed, her smile deepening. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded printout. "Public record," she added, sliding it across the counter. I unfolded it and read. It wasn't a generic slap on the wrist. It was specific, pointed, and written in formal HOA language that didn't leave any room for interpretation. Misuse of HOA authority. Harassment of a lawful resident. Fabrication of an emergency report to law enforcement. Her privileges as a committee member had been suspended for 12 months. She was barred from enforcing or even pretending to enforce HOA rules during that time. And any future incident would lead to automatic fines and possible legal action. I couldn't help but grin. So, that envelope this morning? Her copy, Elena said with a nod. And the best part? They're announcing the disciplinary action in the next community bulletin. No names, of course, but everybody will know. We didn't need to imagine Karen's reaction. I'd seen the way she froze on her porch. I could picture her inside right now, pacing with the paper in her hands, scanning it for some loophole or way to fight back. But Elena had seen to it that there wasn't one. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I happened to glance across the street. Karen's living room lights were on, her silhouette moving in slow, agitated circuits from window to table and back again. At one point she stopped, leaning both hands on the table like she needed to steady herself. It wasn't the stance of someone plotting her next move. It was the stance of someone realizing the board wasn't going to protect her anymore. Elena didn't say much about it. She didn't have to. The quiet satisfaction in her expression spoke louder than words. She'd fought Karen on Karen's own turf and won. And now the very system Karen had tried to use against us had turned on her. The street felt different that night. No tension, no suspicion, no unspoken threat hanging in the air. Just an unfamiliar kind of peace, one that I realized we hadn't felt here since the day we moved in. A week after the official violation notice landed in Karen's mailbox, the street had gone unusually calm. Too calm. She'd vanished from her regular posts. No morning lurking at her window, no intercepting delivery drivers, no surprise strolls with her clipboard. If she was plotting something, she was keeping it quiet. But the thing about people like Karen? They hate silence even more than they hate losing control. It was late afternoon when the sound of a car door shutting caught my attention. I looked out and saw a dark sedan pulling up in front of Karen's house. It wasn't the mail truck. It wasn't a delivery van. This was different. The driver stepped out, dressed neatly in a black skirt suit, a leather satchel slung across her shoulder. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. Karen must have been watching from inside because her front door opened just as the woman reached the porch. Karen stepped out cautiously, her arms folded, trying to project confidence but already looking defensive. The woman introduced herself briefly, then reached into her satchel and pulled out a thick white envelope. She didn't hand it over right away. She read Karen's full name out loud, making sure she was speaking to the right person. Karen nodded stiffly. That's when the woman said the words I could hear even from my porch. You've been served. It was such a clean, matter-of-fact delivery that it took a second for the weight of it to sink in. Karen didn't move at first, just stared at the envelope like she was trying to process whether this was real. The woman didn't linger. She placed the envelope firmly in Karen's hands, got her signature on a small clipboard and turned to leave. The whole thing took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like a slow-motion scene from a movie. Karen's composure cracked the moment the woman was halfway back to her car. She tore at the flap, pulling the papers out with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the first page and the color drained from her face. She glanced toward the street, maybe to see who was watching, but she must have known it was too late. I didn't need to guess what was in those papers. Elena had hinted at it the night before when she came back from her laptop session with that same quiet, dangerous calm she always had when she was working on something big. She didn't say the words directly, but she had mentioned formal civil action and personal liability for damages. Elena had done more than defend herself in front of the HOA board. She'd followed through. She'd taken every incident, every false call, every fabricated violation, every attempt to intimidate us, and compiled them into a rock-solid harassment claim. And now Karen wasn't just facing the HOA. She was facing legal action with her own name at the top of the complaint. From my porch, I could see Karen flipping through page after page, her head shaking slightly as she read. She muttered something under her breath, then snapped the papers back into the envelope and stormed inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. A couple of neighbors were out walking their dogs, and they'd stopped mid-stride to watch the whole scene. One of them, an older man with a baseball cap pulled low, gave me a knowing smirk as he passed. "Guess it's her turn now," he murmured. Elena came out onto our porch a few minutes later, drying her hands on a dish towel. She followed my gaze toward Karen's house but didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. "That the courier?" she asked casually. "Yep," I said. "She's got it." Elena nodded once, almost to herself. "Good. She's been making people's lives miserable for too long. Time someone held her accountable." She tossed the towel over her shoulder and leaned against the railing, her expression unreadable except for the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Across the street, Karen's blinds shifted slightly, just enough to reveal the edge of her face. She was watching us now, probably running through all the ways this could go wrong for her. For once, she didn't have the upper hand. For once, she was the one on defense. The street stayed quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from peace. It was the kind that comes when everyone knows the next chapter is going to be even bigger than the last, and no one wants to miss it. The next few days after Karen got served were like watching a storm cloud hover over just one house. The rest of the neighborhood carried on as usual, kids riding bikes, sprinklers ticking in the afternoon sun, neighbors chatting over hedges, but Karen's place was different. Curtains stayed drawn tight. No cars came or went. Even her porch light, which usually clicked on every evening right on schedule, stayed dark. It wasn't until the fourth day that we saw her again. She came out in the middle of the afternoon, moving slowly, like she was trying not to be noticed. She carried a small stack of envelopes to her mailbox, and I recognized one immediately. It was the same thick, heavy kind that had been delivered to her days earlier. Only this time it was outgoing. She slipped it into the slot, stood there for a second, then walked back toward her house with her head down. Elena didn't comment. She was at the kitchen table, laptop open, her focus on a spreadsheet. But I could tell she knew exactly what that letter was, a formal response to the legal complaint. And from the way Karen had been acting, it probably wasn't a defiant one. Later that evening, while we were sitting on the porch, the phone buzzed on the table beside Elena. She glanced at the screen, and a small smile crept onto her face. "It's our attorney," she said, answering. The conversation was short, just a few clipped phrases and quiet nods on Elena's part. When she hung up, she looked out toward Karen's darkened house and let out a small breath. "She's not fighting it," Elena said. "At least not in court. She's already contacted mediation. Wants to settle privately." I raised an eyebrow. "That quick?" "Bullies collapse fast when the system stops protecting them," Elena replied. "She knows she can't win." The following week, a neutral third-party mediator arranged a meeting at a downtown office. It wasn't in a courtroom, but it might as well have been for how tense it felt walking in. Karen was already there when we arrived, sitting stiffly in a navy blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun. She didn't look at us. Didn't even glance up when we sat across from her at the long conference table. The mediator, a calm, gray-haired man, went through the formalities. Then Elena laid out her terms. No raised voice, no drama, just a list delivered with the same calm precision she'd shown at the HOA meeting. Cease all contact unless absolutely necessary. No false reports to law enforcement. No fabricated HOA violations. Public acknowledgement, through the HOA newsletter, that the previous eviction notice against her had no legal basis. And finally, full reimbursement of all legal fees we'd incurred. Karen's attorney leaned in, whispering in her ear. She didn't respond right away, just kept her eyes fixed on the table. But eventually she nodded, once sharply. Her attorney spoke for her. We agreed to the terms. It was over in less than an hour. No drawn-out fight. No last-minute theatrics. Just a quiet, complete retreat. When we stepped back outside into the afternoon sunlight, it felt like the air was lighter somehow. Not because of the win, though that was satisfying, but because the constant, grinding tension that had hung over our home since the day we moved in was gone. Over the next few days, subtle changes began to ripple through the neighborhood. Karen stopped glancing out from behind her blinds whenever we walked past. Her car was gone more often than not. The porch light clicked on again at night, but there was no sign of her standing in the doorway, keeping watch like some self-appointed sheriff. She had receded into the background, just another neighbor instead of the force she once tried to be. One afternoon, while I was out front trimming the hedge, a neighbor I barely knew strolled past with his dog. He nodded toward Karen's house and said quietly, "Never thought I'd see the day." Then he gave me a knowing smile and kept walking. Elena never bragged about it. She didn't bring it up unless someone asked, and even then she kept her answers short. But there was a new calm about her, the kind that comes when you've faced something head-on and refused to be pushed aside. She had not only defended herself, she'd changed the balance of the entire neighborhood. And now, for the first time since we arrived, our home actually felt like ours. It was strange how quickly the street adjusted to the new reality. 4 months, Karen's shadow had stretched over every front yard, every passing car, every package left on a porch. But now, it was as if that shadow had lifted, and sunlight was finally reaching the corners it had never touched before. Neighbors who once kept their heads down started lingering in their yards again. Kids played basketball in driveways without Karen pulling up to lecture about noise ordinances. Weekend barbecues cropped up like they used to, with music drifting through the air instead of constant watchful eyes. And Karen, she was still here but different. She moved quieter now, slower, like she was walking on ground that wasn't hers anymore. No more clipboard. No more suspicious stares from behind blinds. When she did appear, she kept her head down, avoiding conversations, almost pretending she didn't see anyone. It was a strange thing to witness. The woman who once thought she could control every detail of this neighborhood reduced to someone just trying to blend in. One Saturday morning, Elena and I were on the porch, coffee in hand, when Karen stepped outside to check her mail. She looked across the street and for the first time in months, our eyes met. She didn't glare. She didn't scowl. She just gave the smallest nod before looking away. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was the closest thing we were ever going to get. Elena didn't react, just took another sip of her coffee. But I saw the flicker in her eyes, the quiet recognition that the war was over and she'd won. Life settled into a rhythm again. Elena went back to her work without the constant interruptions. I stopped glancing over my shoulder every time a car slowed near the house. Even the HOA board seemed to carry themselves differently at the next meeting, more careful, more aware that their authority had limits. It wasn't just a win for us, it was a reminder for the whole community that no one was untouchable. One evening, a few weeks later, we decided to take a walk just as the sun was going down. The air was warm and the smell of grilling steaks drifted from a couple of houses down. As we passed one yard, a neighbor waved us over. He handed Elena a plate of cookies and grinned. "For keeping the streets sane," he said. "You have no idea how long we've been waiting for someone to stand up to her." Elena laughed softly. "I think I might have an idea." We kept walking, and as the last bit of sunlight disappeared, I realized something had shifted inside me too. When we'd first moved here, I thought we'd made a mistake, that we'd accidentally walked into a trap we couldn't get out of. But now this neighborhood felt different. Safer. Ours. It wasn't just that Karen had backed off, it was that the whole block had seen it happen. They'd watched Elena dismantle the very system Karen had tried to weaponize. And in doing so, she'd set a precedent. If you tried to push people around here, you'd better be ready for them to push back harder. Karen still kept to herself, but now she wasn't feared. She was just there. And in a way, that was the biggest change of all. She wasn't the center of the neighborhood anymore. She wasn't the gatekeeper. She was just another person on the street, one whose power had been stripped down to nothing but the square of grass in front of her house. As we turned back toward home, the porch light clicked on, casting a warm glow across our driveway. Elena stepped inside ahead of me, the sound of her keys dropping into the bowl by the door marking the end of the day. I paused for a moment, looking back toward Karen's house. Her windows were dark. Her porch light was off. For the first time since moving here, I didn't feel the weight of someone watching. I didn't feel the need to brace for the next confrontation. And that quiet, steady calm was worth more than any dramatic victory. Elena had given us our home back. And maybe, just maybe, she'd given the whole neighborhood a little peace too.